I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Eamonn Ansbro, Director and Research Astronomer at Kingsland Observatory in Ireland. Dr. Ansbro has a master's in astronomy from the University of Western Sydney in Australia, and a master's in philosophy and PhD degree in astronomy from the Planetary Space Science Research Institute at the Open University in the UK. He's a member of a number of prominent UFO and UAP organizations, including the Scientific Coalition for Unidentified Aerospace Phenomena, SETI, the International Aeronautical Federation, and the Royal Astronomical Society. So, Eamonn, welcome. I want to start with current headlines. So let me ask, what are your thoughts on the current AARO investigation of the UAP phenomenon, as well as recent claims by former intelligence officer David Grush that the U.S. defense establishment is hiding crashed flying saucers?
Indeed. I think we have a dichotomy here between two entities, AARO being one, which is the office set up for the UAP, and then we have David Grush, who has come forward independently. Okay, the dichotomy is showing up quite strongly here because, or quite widely, because I think you also have regulations or restrictions from the AARO side, as I understand it, under some security level. And therefore, we're not getting the same information as what David Grush has provided. I suspect they actually know, but due to the regulations, they're confined to what they can say at that particular meeting. With David Grush, it is quite a bombshell. It's nothing new. It's very new for a lot of the new entrance into the UAP area from all different disciplines, not just the public who are curious about it, the media, the academics, and so forth. So as if it's like a whole new discovery, new revelations for all these people. This is old stuff, and you can go back 50 or 60 years. And one of the researchers that I was really inspired by way back 35 years ago was Leonard Stringfield. And some of your viewers who have been into the UAP research for decades will know about him, because his research was very testable. And in fact, when you go through the various crashes, and also he brings in the retrieval side of it, it's like, I mean, I can imagine at the time it was quite astonishing for some people, and would rule it out, of course, because, you know, UFOs didn't exist, so to speak. Never mind UFO crashes and retrievals. It sounded like science fiction. But I read all his material 35 years ago, and with an open mind for it. So that's my take between the AARO investigations and the Grush bombshell information has just come out. I'm sure there's a lot more. I'm sure there's a lot more to go in this. It's still unfolding. There's like announcements nearly every 2 weeks going on from somewhere.
There is. Well, and I appreciate your thoughts on it. You have been studying the UFO UAP phenomena for decades, and this has been traditionally a pariah of the scientific establishment until just recently. Now it's being openly discussed in the US Congress and Senate. So is this discussion, along with the whistleblower and up-and-coming reverse engineering legislation, a win for scientific inquiry?
Well, it's certainly en route to a possible win, as long as the science fraternity has sufficient data, sufficient evidence for this. We're still in a dichotomy in this one, but I think what is wonderful that's happened is that it's made us aware through the media, and it actually has triggered off some scientists in this field, and also has caused the establishment of UAP type organizations dealing with the scientific side of it. SKU would be a good example of that, SCU. So I'm very happy about that. And surprisingly, some of the scientists that I've seen over the years have been totally skeptical in this area are now warming to it, where they thought it was, you know, science fiction, and now it's science fact.
Absolutely. Well, it's just this overwhelming amount of evidence. And as you mentioned, every couple of weeks, a new story comes out with more evidence, right? So I think that science in general is warming to it. Um, so again, you've been analyzing UFO reports for decades. Back in 2001, you wrote a paper that indicated that Earth was under surveillance by extraterrestrials, and you presented that at a SETI conference in California. So that's like 21 years ago. Can you tell me what led you to write that paper and how was it received?
Okay. Well, in the lead up to the developing of the paper came about through at least 10 years of research in my spare time. I wasn't a full paid scientist working in this area, but in my spare time, I devoted it to this. And so, like in anything in science, you're dealing with the observations, you're dealing with some sort of instrumentation. This is the astrophysical approach to it, and that's what I took. That's the approach I took. But it was really very confusing after about a year because I had to deal with lots of witnesses who were pretty stable of what they were seeing. But after a while, I had to find out, well, are there others around the world seeing or observing the same thing? And indeed, there were. I actually got tens of thousands of reports from different centers from the US, France, the UK, and so forth, which show that it was common throughout the world. So it was from that, actually, rather like Dr. Jacques Vallée, he was looking for patterns and cycles to all this. So I wrote two articles back in 1992 suggesting that there has to be some pattern to this, possibly, you know. And so I had some ideas on that. It was very early days. Article came out in a scientific magazine. Very difficult to get anything through a scientific journal, be peer reviewed, would be thrown out, of course. Anything to do with UFOs was a very bad mantra, to other scientists. So anyway, someone else actually had seen what I'd written, and I joined up with him. He was an aerospace engineer. And from there, we eventually worked out a model. Indeed, there were patterns and cycles to it. Now, mind you, it was very rudimentary, the approach we had taken, but we did make some discoveries en route, which, if you like, I can go into it, but maybe more detail later on. But just to say to you that I think we had enough information to demonstrate that this was testable. And in fact, we actually did get some results from it. Ideally, if we had the right funding, certainly if it was NASA type funding, I think we would have actually made the breakthrough 20 years ago. But you have to appreciate we're citizen scientists doing this kind of work privately for a subject that doesn't exist. So you're dealing with a perception problem here, a worldview. But anyway, we kept going on, and we ended up. Some of the tests appear to be working, and I felt comfortable to actually publish the first research paper on this, and that's why I presented it at the SETI conference in 2001. And you can imagine. If I use the word UFO at that conference, with SETI, again, it would be a bad mantra. So I had to use pseudonyms, use different language for this. So I won't go into all the details what language I use, but when you read the paper, you think, oh gosh, there's nothing about UFOs in this. Well, actually, it's all about UFOs, but if you want a glossary of terminology, new terminology, where you're trying to avoid the enemy, this may be the approach to take. So yes, some people actually there at the conference did sniff out that this was UFOs, and in fact, actually, this mirrored on me actually that evening, where I wasn't invited to the dinner. That was the first thing, so that told me a lot. And then the next morning, I was approached by a well-known SETI scientist that was concerned about my research, and that 50% of the scientists at the dinner thought I had perpetrated a hoax on the community, and the other 50% felt, well, this guy has some data here. There's something in this. So I thought, well, we're getting somewhere. But I had I had nobody warming to me at all. I was completely isolated at this. And then even the third day, I went up. It was rather like you have a panel up there, and you have the opportunity of presenting more material. And I actually went up and I said, look, I understand there's a problem with the paper. I said I have 41 references to back this up and all the data, and that still annoyed them. It appeared to be as if one was uh, coming into how should I put it? There's such resistance to it. But look, I plodded on. I was very determined to get this paper published because I knew others out there didn't have a reference for something like this. There was no theory on UFOs. Here we were demonstrating a theory on UFOs, and this would be a reference point for many other people around the world, scientists or the public to look at. So there you
Well,
go.
and I appreciate your sharing that because earlier this year, Harvard astronomer Dr. Avi Loeb co-authored a paper with AARO director Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, which states that UFOs may be small probes visiting planets in our solar system released from a larger vehicle for surveillance purposes. So they are basically saying the same thing that you said 20 years ago. Do you feel like your model has been vindicated by this?
Oh, I do indeed. But also, the work that we did over 20 years ago is quite sophisticated. It's not just based on astrophysical approach to this or extrapolating so much from a hypothesis that you're dealing with. What we're showing here in the paper, when I say we, well, it was myself actually that did the paper, but I have a colleague who uh, he didn't want to be involved in the paper. I think I think it's a bit too much for some people, to stretch people when you're in that arena. Um, but yes, I mean, you could say it's an old theory, of what Avi Loeb was talking about. I mean, it had been suggested even back in I think it was back in the 60s, um, about probes coming into, our solar system and possibly ejecting probes as well. But in my case, actually, I was going into the patterns and cycles to show to demonstrate this. I mean, that's another like a rather a quantum leap, you could say, from just making these hypothetical statements there.
Yeah. Well, in the time that's elapsed since you wrote that paper, because again, many, many years have passed, data has continued to accrue. Would you say that that's reinforcing this? Is this just continuing to prove that model?
Yeah, I mean, for example, just okay, just to let you know, Tim, I'm working with another astrophysicist at the moment in Europe, and because we were using old operating systems of the 1980s, real old vintage stuff, and then using Fortran. It never changed from that. We used that for many years. But now I made a decision there some weeks ago because I've had quite a response from many others around the world through media, which I didn't expect at all, to say that, we really want to know more about this. And so I made a decision to upgrade the whole theory to bring it into a position where others will be able to understand. There's a whole explanation behind this, but done scientifically. And so it means actually, as we speak now, Tim, that we're collecting tens of thousands of reports from around the world to upgrade this model. And we'll probably actually have other features on the model that weren't there originally because we didn't have sophisticated software at the time. But this time I think we will, particularly bringing in AI into it. But I'll give you some examples. What we have discovered, and as suggested in the stated in the paper, and now for the research we're upgrading now, is a programmed autonomous surveillance of the Earth by UAPs. And I think in a previous presentation to APEC, I was showing that this is based on synchronized orbital tracks. These are synchronized orbital tracks with the same rotation as the Earth. So it's rotating at the same time. This is different to artificial satellites, which are based on gravity and the 90-minute duration it takes. What we're dealing with here and what we discovered is intersection orbital tracks around the Earth. And I'll just take some examples, and these are the more recent ones. If we look at some of the events like Michigan, Lake Michigan 1994, or the Nimitz 2004, and the USS Omaha 2019, they show large spans of space and time, which may be difficult to relate to specific orbital tracks in close proximity. Now, the orbital periods, as I mentioned, are around 65 minutes, which also gives the UAPs many opportunities to reach destinations in space. That's assuming there are extraterrestrial and they're within the solar system. And now we have tried linking these events to different orbital tracks. That means very good observation in terms of movements and timings, and also estimations of any uncertainties in these parameters. Now, one of the interesting features of the UAP was observed by radar in the Nimitz case, the Nimitz event, which indicated UAPs were coming from an altitude of 26 kilometers. When returning to this altitude, the radar measured the UAP went south at a speed of 100 knots. Now that's incredibly slow, but the important part is when they determined the velocity at the 80,000 feet down to, I think it's 50 feet above MSL, was 0.78 of a second. So that's different to the other speed I was talking about. Now it might be that it could have waited for the larger UAP. We're talking about some sort of superstructure, super construct there. This would be much bigger than the probes we're talking about. Don't ask me about the shape. This is purely hypothetical. All right. But it's also interesting that this was also a water event, which may be a strong correlation, which really has to be investigated further, because the whole water events are seen to be really key to this in the last 10 or 15 years. And it certainly has come through a lot of the military events in the US, of course.
What do you have any thoughts on possible intent? Again, you've described basically a clandestine coordinated surveillance. I believe those are your words from an earlier presentation. Do you have any thoughts on why this might be occurring, what they may be trying to learn or observe?
Yeah, well, yes, I'm convinced we're dealing with a surveillance. We're dealing with, it's well coordinated, it's programmed, it's autonomous. And I suspect it's been going on way back to the 1880s, and that's based on other reports that we've got that we included in the model itself. So it's pre-aeronautical. So when we talk about other types of craft, shapes, like triangles, cigars, and so forth, and flying saucers, triangles were recorded visually back in the 1892 and 1895 in Indonesia and also in Edinburgh. So that's the triangular type of construct. So it's not something that just appeared on the scene since the 1940s and 50s. So, we have to take all the data into account and work from there. Yeah, so that, to answer your question, I mean, I was inspired myself by Professor James MacDonald in the 1968 Congress hearing that he did, because his conclusion was that UFOs were, he suspected it was, and this is his quotation now, that it was a tentative surveillance of the Earth by UFOs. That was my inspiration to look into this even further.
Ah, okay. Well, let me jump into the communications part of this, because in addition to the surveillance hypothesis, I believe that you also have said that ET is using a form of superluminal quantum communication for instantaneous communications, basically, to bypass the speed of light, which is going to slow radio signals. And that makes so much sense, because if you are exploring the galaxy, if you have craft that are spread over large distances, radio signals are just too slow. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
Yeah, I agree with you entirely on that. Yeah, because when I looked into this many, many years ago, and also being in SETI, that I was really going against the whole approach with SETI using the radio spectrum and microwave, and in fact, the whole EM spectrum itself, if we're trying to find an ETC. So back about 10 years ago, I thought, now, let me put myself into, if I was an extraterrestrial at an advanced level, how would I do all this? How would I go forward, with a collective, with others? And I think the first thing I would do is, being on another planet, I would actually have worked out my planetary affairs with whoever organization I was dealing with on that planet. Because once you've worked out your planetary affairs, then you're in a position to expand from there. With us, actually, we're not there yet. We're still in a state of flux. But hopefully over time, we will get there. So assuming actually that an ETC has explored its neighborhood, stellar neighborhood we're talking about, where distances are whatever, 50 light years, 400 light years or whatever, you're not going to use the EM spectrum for communications. And also, you're not going to use travel either using chemical rockets. That's totally out. So there has to be other advanced means of propulsion that is beyond our concept of the way we're doing things. So sorry, I'm just trying to get around to get the background of this first, then leading into what I think they're using is quantum superluminal communications, or faster than light communications, and similarly with faster than light travel would be included in that as well. So how does it work? Well, you're into a which you can't, there's nothing in the textbook to do this. So you're going on the actual physics that we know so far. We've got into the quantum mechanics area. We do have a dichotomy between quantum mechanics and physics. And also you're stepping into the no-no areas for scientists that do not like to go into, and that's to deal with consciousness, because that's one of the key factors, I think, in this. And so consciousness, the QM area, I think is key actually to the communications with ETC.
Ah, okay. Well, and that was one of the things I was going to ask about because, one of the things that I think is really important is um, understanding this communication, which I think speaks directly to the Fermi paradox and the Drake equation, right? And that's why we're not seeing signals from ET because they're potentially broadcasting on a different spectrum. So maybe EM is something that civilizations grow through, right? Where they broadcast as we do. They broadcast for a few centuries and then they develop something more effective. And that could explain why the universe isn't full of radio signals, because it's something that's a very brief window in each civilization's development.
Mhm. Yes.
Okay. Well, so contemporary quantum signaling requires measurements on physically separated entangled particles, but mainstream physics maintains that that's not superluminal. Um, do you have any ideas on how this may work, I guess, as a superluminal communications medium?
Yeah, I do agree with you. There is quite a lot of resistance to this approach because it looks impossible. I think when you're still stuck in the, actually put it, the conventional physics world, and even if you stretch yourself to QM, still there appears to be a problem for others. Um, I think, like in anything in this approach to possible QSC, you have to do it on a step-by-step process. So from our end, I'm working with, and he actually had given a presentation to you a year and a half ago, was Dr. Hugh Deasy, and we've been both working together on this. But I must say, Hugh is really the instigator behind a lot of this, more than myself. We can't do everything. Me trying to work out control surveillance of UFOs or where to find them to work on communications, just like that. You think
Yeah.
it's like a one-man show, you know. So yeah, so we do have another, Hugh DC on that. So Hugh's approach to this, and we have this in the laboratory at the moment, testing this. We've gone the approach of telephone anti-telephone. That's the methodology we're going. Now, in the telephone anti-telephone, what we have to achieve, that this would be the precursor before leading into the QSE. Um, if you can achieve, say, a time latency with the TAT, telephone anti-telephone, then you're going to set the foundation then for the next step, which is the QSE. So as we speak now, we did further tests there early, yes, about a year ago, and didn't work for us. However, we know how should I put it? We know actually how to do it now. It's, I could say it's wonderful to have the failures, because if you don't, you don't learn from the failures. But then when we had the failure, okay, we got it. I think we know how to do this now. So we're actually developing quite a complex system as a modification on the system that we have. And that means then when we have a working model of this, we'll test it out and hopefully we'll get time latency from it.
It's an iterative process, definitely.
It
Do you
is, yeah.
think once you've developed this further, do you think it might be possible to actually listen in on possible ET communications?
Well, this is an interesting bit. Um, yeah, I mean, when you think of it, Tim, if we assume that there are thousands and thousands of ETCs out there, crikey, it's not like a radio dialing you you sort of tune into them. I don't know how we're going to do this. I think what could happen is that we would actually pick them up and somebody up, but how are we going to deal with this? Well, um, we will try and figure out how to communicate, but it's actually put it, we're individual scientists, we're not even funded by anybody trying to do this. And um I, I don't know the answer how to discriminate from one ETC with another. I just don't know how to do that. All I know is that, like what you mentioned, yes, we could pick up a mix of ETCs, and we wouldn't be able to differentiate any of them at all. Probably wouldn't even know that we had an ETC there. I don't know. So yeah, it's down the line, that one. I think also maybe we need to develop our consciousness side of things as well in this. So that's something that I have done some work on. In fact, I did present this in a previous presentation to APEC, and that is co-creative science. Because in science, science is mechanistic in its approach in the last 200 years. And we've done some tests applying co-creative science. That is tuning into the nature intelligence or the universe, which is all conscious, and then applying the scientific mechanistic side to it as well. So we'd set up a project, we'd have say a definition behind this project, whatever that is, and then a direction to it and a purpose behind it. So I mean, I do know, I'm absolutely convinced now that the universe is not just conscious and living. It's like we are it. We're all part of it, and so therefore we need to use the potential that's already in there. So we've actually done this, and it works. This co-creative science approach. So it's like everything else in these experiments. We could bring that part into it to possibly differentiate from one ETC and another, maybe. I don't know. You know, we're still early days on that one.
Wonderful. Well, Eamonn, let me thank you so much for your time today. It has been a true pleasure and an absolute honor having you with us. Let me close by asking what comes next for you, and what do you predict that we will see in the headlines over the course of this year?
Okay. Well, I'm hoping that I think we will see, how shall I put it? I think thanks to the media and many other things like that, I think we'll certainly get a significant small d disclosure evolving. And the small d disclosure, if powerful enough, could be the force that's needed for the big d disclosure. But it's a balancing act. You know, you have resistance there from other factions, and then you have others say, you know, we're going for it, get it out there, you know, the disclosure. And I think it's wonderful that it's not just the UFO community and some of the scientific community that is open to all this, but it's affecting many others around it. As long as I would say people, if they've got a seed, it's rather like an organic expansion here. Once you've got one seed for somebody thinking about this for the very first time, that's good enough. It's in their thought. And because every single person on this planet is wondering why they're here, what's this all about? Well, I think this is part of the answer we're going to find out about our history, about everything, about us.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure.